pressure on a daily basis. Vastly outnumbered by their Arab opponents, the IDF faced thousands of enemy troops across heavily fortified frontiers. There is also the ongoing struggle surrounding Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, resulting in the Intifada rebellion. Israeli settlements are virtual armed camps. In the streets of Arab neighborhoods, Israeli soldiers are sometimes forced into running street battles. Policing of the West Bank and Gaza is a role the Israeli military is not entirely comfortable with. Traditionally, the army has been on the front lines in all wars since Israel was founded in 1948. They were never intended to be an army of occupation involved in a guerrilla war that military strength alone cannot win. For them, peace will ultimately come because of a political settlement. But while diplomats negotiate, the army does its duty, a mission that began even before the State of Israel was born. The birth of modern Israel was rooted in the bloody battles fought in the trenches of Flanders during the First World War. Britain was sacrificing tens of thousands of its young men in an increasingly costly war. The army and the treasury were rapidly being depleted. Help was desperately needed. Britain turned to the then sizable European Jewish community, which had become increasingly influential since late in the 19th century. Recognition of their important contribution to the war effort culminated in growing support for the idea of Jews returning to the Holy Land. The Balfour Decree made it official British policy that an independent Jewish state would be created from the ashes of war. When the armistice was signed, Palestine became part of the new British mandate over the region. It appeared that the Balfour Declaration would become reality. Jews from all over Europe began to settle in the historic lands of Israel in ever greater numbers. These were not typical European colonists. They sought to create a special kind of society, built around hard-working farmers toiling away on their kibbutzes in a cooperative effort to create a new homeland. By the late 1930s, hundreds of these settlements had been established throughout Palestine. But the Jews were not alone in Israel. A sizable local Arab population resented this change in what had, over the years, become their land. They fought back. The Jews formed an underground army called the Haganah to defend themselves. At the same time, the British formed an official Jewish police force to keep order. The same men sometimes served in both organizations. The simmering Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine during the 1930s was overshadowed by the German invasion of Poland in 1939, an event that immediately put all European Jews in grave danger. The German military machine rolled into Belgium, Holland, and France. Soon, their panzers threatened to cross the English Channel. The British suffered defeat after defeat. In North Africa, Prime Minister Winston Churchill decided to make a stand. He sent the last fully armed British and Commonwealth troops to Egypt. The risks were obvious. If defeated there, the British Army would cease to be an effective fighting force. Meanwhile, Palestinian Jews not only faced their internal problems, but were threatened by a substantial enemy at their border. The German-dominated Vichy French government controlled Lebanon and Syria. The German armies were bearing down on Cairo. The militant Jewish settlers of Palestine were a resource the British needed. They began to openly arm and train these men. They were formed into a unit called the Palmach, Hebrew for strike companies. The British utilized the Palmach to conduct guerrilla operations against German and Vichy French targets. They were ruthlessly effective. As long as the common foe remained Germany, the British were more than willing to continue training and arming these men, a policy they would later regret. With so many Jews of German and East European descent among those being trained, it became clear that they could be extremely helpful as agents in the war raging in Europe. By now, Jewish women were training with the men, and a special unit was formed to participate in clandestine operations. They received intense training, including airborne assault tactics. Esprit de corps in the Palmach was intense. They were fighting for far more than their settlements. They were defending an ideal and the hope for a permanent home for all Jews. Their motto, Rishonim Tamid Anachnu, we are always first. The Palmach's high standards would be mirrored by all Israeli defense forces. In Europe, the Palmach sought to initiate increased resistance against the Germans. For the most part, though, it was too late. In spite of the heroic efforts of the Palmach, Hitler's final solution had undermined the resolve of many of Europe's Jews. The Palmach fought well, but suffered tremendous casualties. However, the struggle was too important. They were prepared to enter combat again and again to achieve their ultimate goal. After the invasion of Normandy and the year-long battle across France and Germany, the Allies finally defeated Hitler. For the armed Jews of Palestine, it was time to demand what they believed was theirs, an independent homeland. But this too would take time and would not be realized without additional conflict. The highly skilled veterans of the Jewish units had gained invaluable experience during the war. Without their knowing it, it was the time when the future leaders of Israel were being ready to take control. The members of the Palmach turned against the British. They fought a guarded and selective war against their former allies, seeking to attack only military targets. The Jews successfully smuggled survivors of the Holocaust into Palestine. The British had little stomach left for fighting. Yet the war dragged on for 3 years, until the United Nations finally partitioned Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. In 1948, Israel was born. Immediately, the Arabs attacked. For the 600,000 Palestinian Jews, it was the start of the War of Independence. The guerrilla bands of the Palmach were ill-suited to engage in a full-scale conventional war. The solution was the formation of the Israeli Defense Force on May 31st, 1948. It initially consisted of 8 brigades, but little heavy weaponry. Using tactics learned from the British, the Israelis improvised and engaged the Arab armies. The command structure of the IDF was modeled along the lines of the British Army. Its form was entirely different, however. This was a democratic army. Spit and polish formality was not important. Israel's small size and limited finances dictated a small standing army with a large ready reserve. Universal military service for both men and women ensured that most Israelis received some service experience. Driven by boundless enthusiasm and almost fanatical devotion to their country, Israeli troops held their ground with their backs literally to the sea. They would either be victorious or the new state of Israel would cease to exist. Even with scant resources, the Israelis gradually built up their elite forces. They faced many challenges and were desperately short of equipment. The initial material assets of the IDF paratroop unit were 1 dilapidated Curtiss C-46 commando aircraft and 4,000 second-hand parachutes, which had been bought as scrap to make silk shirts. The unit consisted of a mixture of Israeli veterans of the British Army and the Palmach, graduates of a parachute course held in Czechoslovakia, resistance veterans, ghetto survivors, and a certain number of adventurers. Frequent infiltration by Arab terrorists led to the formation of a small unit especially trained for reprisal operations. Named the 101st and under the command of Ariel Arik Sharon, they were highly successful. By 1954, the 101st had been absorbed into the 890th Paratroop Battalion, also under the command of Sharon. The paratroopers expanded to brigade strength, and over the next 2 years, frequently demonstrated their effectiveness in major retaliatory raids in Jordan and Lebanon. The IDF's next major challenge came in 1956, when Egypt's strongman Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, an act which directly threatened British and French influence in the Middle East. Nasser knew he was courting trouble, but as a proponent of pan-Arab nationalism and with the support of the Soviet Union, he was willing to test the resolve of the Europeans. The Israelis were more than willing to collaborate with the British and French. On October 29, 1956, 16 Israeli Dakota transports dropped a battalion of paratroopers 45 miles from the Suez Canal. Their objective was the strategic Mitla Pass in the Sinai Desert. Operation Kadesh was underway. With the first elements already on the ground, reinforcements were dispatched across the desert to link up with the pathfinders. The Egyptians attacked back. Israeli troops were caught in ambushes and crossfire. Casualties were high. In the battles in and around the Mitla Pass, the Israeli paratroopers lost 38 dead and over 100 wounded, but the Egyptians lost over 260. With Egyptian forces engaging the Israelis, who were relentlessly pushing towards the canal, the British and French forces struck. They attacked the canal zone in a combined amphibious and airborne assault, fighting which shocked the world. The image of Europeans fighting on the streets of the Middle East angered many of the newly emerging independent nations of the Third World. The entire operation was a fiasco. Both the Soviet Union and the United States bitterly resented what they viewed as British and French neo-colonialism. The British, French, and Israelis were forced to withdraw. United Nations forces, in their first major peacekeeping effort, were deployed as a buffer between Egyptian and Israeli forces. Reprisal raids continued over the next 10 years, but it would be in the 1967 Six-Day War that the paratroops next played a crucial leading role. The war would be pivotal in Israel's history. The ceasefire ending the 1948 war created borders leaving much of Israel's civilian population within artillery range of Arab gunners. There was little room for maneuvering. In the Sinai, thousands of Egyptian troops were poised along the border. In the late spring of 1967, Egyptian troops were placed on full alert. On the morning of June 5th, Israel's forces, despite being greatly outnumbered, made a preemptive strike against Egypt. Israeli paratroops were among the first in battle. The fighting was heavy. After just a few days, Egyptian forces had been pushed back. Israeli paratroopers were the first IDF troops to reach the Suez Canal. The paratroopers were involved in many operations throughout the Gaza Strip and along the canal. While the fighting to the south with Egypt was strategically important, the city of Jerusalem was the jewel sought by the Israelis. For what seemed an eternity, The towers, minarets, and ancient Jewish temples of the old city remained just out of reach. The honor of leading the attack on the city fell to the paratroopers, and they were determined to bring the Star of David home. At 2:15 in the morning of June 5th, the attack began. It was a battle with truly biblical overtones. Jordanian forces were determined to defend the city, which carried as much religious significance for them as the Israelis. The crowded warrens of the old city were the scene of intense hand-to-hand combat. The Israeli objective was to secure the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. The fighting raged for 2 days. Victory and defeat were measured by yards gained and lost. By 8:30 on the morning of June 7th, the Israelis approached the heart of the city. Through Herod's and Lion's Gate they advanced, taking great care to ensure that there was no damage to the holiest shrines of Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. By noon, Colonel Mordecai Gur, commander of the assault, sent this communication. The Temple Mount is in our hands. I repeat, the Temple Mount is in our hands. 2 millennia had passed since the city was in the hands of the Jews, and 25 years had passed since Hitler decreed the final solution. Israel vowed Jerusalem would never again be denied to them. The Temple Mount and Wailing Wall survived the carnage. These holy grounds became a new symbol of the military prowess of the Israelis, a heritage linked to the Old Testament and the bravery of David against Goliath. This tie between past and present has been memorialized ever since the Six-Day War. All elite forces and paratroopers swearing-in ceremonies are conducted at the Wailing Wall. Large-scale Palestinian guerrilla infiltration across the Jordan River began immediately following the Six-Day War. Law and order had to be established in the area. The Valley Brigade was formed. The campaign in the Jordan Valley was characterized by mirdafim, or pursuits. On foot and in helicopters, activity continued until the terrorists were killed or captured. Cross-border ambushes were also carried out. Israel's military prowess became legend among the world's military. At a time when American forces were bogged down in the Vietnam War, and British and French military forces were withdrawing from overseas bases, the IDF seemed invulnerable. But the Arabs still sought revenge for their humiliating defeat in the 1967 war and the subsequent loss of Jerusalem. In the summer of 1973, Arab armies were building up their forces along the ceasefire line with Israel. The Israelis remained vigilant, but did not mobilize, nor did they feel a preemptive strike against the Arabs was necessary. This proved to be a near fatal mistake. On October 6th, the Egyptians and Syrians struck, signaling the start of the Yom Kippur War. Israel had moved quickly to mobilize, but it would take many hours for their forces to reach the front. The IDF fought a defensive war, desperately trying to slow the Arab advance. Their main advantages were superior training, sophisticated equipment, and of course, a great sense of motivation. After sustaining bruising punishment, the Israelis counterattacked and began pushing the Arabs back. However, the battle was no longer limited to Israel and her Arab neighbors. The war appeared to be escalating. The superpowers became involved. The Soviets undertook a massive airlift of supplies to the Arabs. The Israelis had pushed the Syrians back, and Damascus was within artillery range of the IDF. The Russians announced they had placed thousands of paratroops on alert. They were openly mobilizing forces in the southern Soviet Union. The specter of Soviet ground troops deployed in the Middle East raised the crisis to a new level. Meanwhile, the Americans began a resupply effort to the Israelis, but this was slow in getting underway. With the Soviet mobilization, the Americans placed their nuclear arsenal on alert. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Meanwhile, the Israelis battled the Egyptian forces back across the Suez Canal, and their forces were virtually unopposed on the road to Cairo. But the war had become too dangerous for the world to allow it to continue. The Soviets and Americans agreed that a ceasefire would be implemented. The elite forces of the IDF were involved throughout the Yom Kippur War, but were primarily in the role of conventional forces. Fighting was too intense and started too suddenly for detailed operations to be planned and implemented. The paratroopers were among those forces involved in the fiercest fighting. They were the first to stem the Egyptian attack. They then led the counteroffensive against the Syrians on the Golan Heights and the Egyptians along the Suez Canal. The peace initiative forced on Israel deprived the Israeli army of the near-total victory that many soldiers believed was within their grasp. They were at the gates of Damascus and were moving ever closer to Cairo. The irony of the Yom Kippur War was that the Egyptians had regained enough confidence to make peace with Israel. The Camp David Accords gave Israel a secure border with Egypt. The IDF could turn its attention to the uneasy ceasefire with Syria, the turmoil in Lebanon, and the unrelenting terrorist war. There were many small skirmishes between Arab groups and the IDF. Some were unpublicized. Others became painful public spectacles. In July 1976, the paratroopers provided the men for the raid on Entebbe, where they lost their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Netanyahu, who was leading his men, as always, from the front. 100 hostages were returned safely to Israel with only 4 casualties. 13 terrorists and 35 Ugandans were killed in the air rescue that heroically demonstrated the daring dedication, efficiency, and resourcefulness of the IDF. Various Arab groups rallied to fight Israel in its struggle with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and this became the main focus for the Israeli units. By 1982, the PLO under Yasser Arafat was headquartered in Beirut, a city torn apart by fighting among rival groups, some friendly to Israel. The chaos of Lebanon threatened to spill over the border, and Israeli towns along the Lebanese border were subject to attack. In an exercise called Operation Peace for Galilee, orchestrated by Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, the seasoned veterans of the anti-terrorist 101st Group moved into southern Lebanon in an attempt to crush the PLO. The objectives of the war were not as clear-cut as others involving Israel. Her survival was not directly threatened, and the internal politics of Lebanon were very complex. Israeli forces easily outfought PLO conventional military units, but the battlefield was not clearly drawn. Pitched battles were fought in refugee camps and crowded streets. Ultimately, the PLO was forced to withdraw from the city, but Lebanon was left shattered. The anarchy that prevailed was in some ways more dangerous to the Israelis than the PLO threat prior to the invasion. Popular support for the Army, which had always been strong, suddenly ebbed. The Americans, along with French, British, and other Western troops, landed in Beirut in a vain attempt to bring order. The Israelis eventually withdrew, leaving a Lebanese Christian army in control of the border region. Syrian army units also moved into Lebanon to help restore order, and slowly a semblance of peace came back to Lebanon. But there would be no peace for the IDF. The uprising of Arabs in the occupied West Bank kept the army on alert. It developed new tactics in dealing with civil unrest, where there is no clearly identifiable enemy, a task that requires the IDF to constantly review its training and strategies. The Intifada might tie down thousands of troops, but the IDF must still remain vigilant, particularly along the frontier with Syria. As with special units worldwide, Israel's elite forces are constantly prepared for action. Currently, there are 5 parachute brigades in the IDF. 2 of these are normally at or very near full strength. 1 is well above 50%, and 2 are at cadre strength. The IDF's efficient call-out and training system ensures that units depending upon reservists to reach war strength are quickly reinforced. The existence of a special group within the IDF parachute troops has been reported from time to time. Designated the 269th Counter-Terrorist Unit, this is said to be the unit which provided men for the raid on Entebbe. If these reports are correct, it can be presumed that the unit is a specially trained and equipped group at a high state of readiness and akin to Germany's GSG-9 in function. There are 5 Israeli elite infantry brigades. Of these, 2 are officially identified as Golani and Givati, both of which deploy a specially trained reconnaissance unit. The rest of the elite brigades are airborne formations of highly trained volunteers who have repeatedly proved themselves in action. There are also the Nahal, which means fighting pioneering infantry units. Extensions of the elite Palmach strike squadrons of the pre-state Haganah Underground, the Nahal formations receive first-class combat training similar to that of airborne forces, including parachute jumps. While the above-mentioned infantry, paratroopers, and Nahal make up the bulk of Israel's elite fighting forces, the real crack formations are the Sarayot, or reconnaissance squadrons. These small units are composed of hand-picked volunteers and commanded by the best officers. Applicants are carefully selected before undergoing a grueling training course according to the highest commando standards. Originally, there were territorial Sararot. Sayeret Shaked operated with the Southern Command and specialized in long-range desert combat with light vehicles. Sayeret Sararet Egos deployed with the Northern Command as a mountain unit. Sayeret Haruv belonged to the Central Command and faced PLO terrorists and infiltrators in the hills and in the Jordan Valley. Little has been published on one other Israeli unit, Sayeret Matkal, Matkal being the Hebrew acronym for GHQ, or General Headquarters. This unit is comprised of the pick of the IDF Elite Force volunteers and rates among the world's top-trained elite units. Sayeret Matkal members are prepared for all kinds of combat and learn, among other things, free-fall parachuting, special cross-country driving, and mountain climbing. A high rate of its men are officer material, making almost every single member a potential leader. Special weapons training is needed in order to qualify, and its fighters can operate almost any kind of weapon from anywhere in the world. Among the elite IDF infantry units, Golani holds a place of honor. Proving its high standards in bitter fighting, the Golani Brigade has proved itself over and over again. With tough competition from the paratroopers and small but highly capable scout and special units, Golani keeps in shape with an exhaustive year-round training program. It deploys actively on the front lines. There are periodic intervals for training even during deployment. All fit males in Israel must perform 3 years of military service, and all may volunteer for the parachute troops. Selection and training are rigorous and emphasize practical military skills, such as weapons training, demolitions, covert cross-border operations, and field medicine. The physical requirements are tough. All must obviously qualify as parachutists, and many then go on to specialize in halo techniques. Night operations and helicopter assault are regularly practiced. Like other units of the IDF, the paratroops use Israeli weapons and equipment wherever possible, supplemented with both purchased items of Western origin and/or captured arms. Parachutes are American, but small arms are Israeli. For many years, the Israeli paratroops have used the Uzi submachine gun, but this is being replaced by the Galil Sar rifle, an Israeli design and produced 5.56 millimeter weapon with a 35-round magazine. An extremely robust and reliable weapon, the Galil incorporates the lessons learned in Israel's continuous conflicts of the past 35 years. Its advantages to the paratroops are that it provides greater range, hitting power, and penetration than the American-made Uzi. IDF paratroopers wear standard Israeli uniforms and helmets. The customary parachutist red beret is worn when the glass fiber combat helmet is not required. The parachutist badge is silver and worn on the left breast above campaign medals. The brigade often participates in large combined desert exercises. Relieved from the constant pressures of peacekeeping in southern Lebanon, the Golani soldiers look forward to this hard work almost as a time of relaxation. Starting with desert orientation and small unit exercises, along with the mandatory intensive physical training and running to keep in shape, the integrated training program begins. Exercises at company and battalion level follow. Helicopter assault, fire support, logistics, resupply, and field camp routines are carefully tested and retaught. Desert training is hard in the winter, too. On long marches, rucksacks are sometimes the only means of supply transportation. For this reason, the brigade and IDF Logistics Command are now studying simple, lightweight webbing. The increased quantities of water needed in desert environments are supplied by expandable water packs, used up before the personal canteens. Present loads are between 25 and 30 kilograms per soldier. Tactically, Golani works according to the IDF Combined Arms Doctrine. Using a typical enemy fortification line constructed by IDF engineers, Golani takes part in combined arms offensive with Merkava tanks, attack helicopters, and massive artillery and air support. The soldiers defended their positions against counterattacks mounted night and day in flat and mountainous terrain, using head-on and flanking moves to surprise the enemy. Golani always tests the Army operations book to its limits. Among the most difficult but also most challenging parts of the training period is the unplanned segment, in which the commanders are faced with the unexpected, pressed for time, and given limited resources. New orders and intelligence reports are issued immediately after the force completes a massive live fire exercise. The soldiers and commanders are tired. Ammunition is in short supply. Casualties need to be evacuated and supplies pulled in when, suddenly, everything has to be put aside and plans formulated to take on a fresh enemy force recently deployed on the battlefield. As much as possible, this phase of the exercise mirrors what actually happens in combat. Battle plans are not always available, and crash course programs must sometimes be followed instead. This entire stage of the exercise is carried out with live ammunition and fire support from air and artillery, which also received surprise orders. In addition, the exercise contains a dry force-on-force stage, with 2 units maneuvering against each other. As no winners are declared, this stage is absolutely wild, with each of the commanders allowed to use every trick imaginable, whether it's in the book or not, in order to gain the upper hand. After these extensive training periods, the brigade returns to its regular routine. Golani employs the standard IDF Elite Infantry Brigade structure. Its battalions have each gained fame in combat, including during the Yom Kippur on the Hermon and the Six-Day War at Tel Fahar. It has a fire support element that includes tow units and heavy mortars, as well as engineer support units. Both operate from APC or on foot. Its reconnaissance unit, Sayeret Golani, gained fame in several raids behind enemy lines and while supporting the brigade at war. The Sayeret suffered a blow during the June 82 Lebanon fighting when Commander Guni Harnik and a number of his officers and men fell in battle against terrorist forces at the Beaufort Castle near Marjayoun. The fortress was eventually taken by the Sayeret. Today, the Sayeret is among the IDF's best special warfare reconnaissance units, used in penetration raids for collecting valuable intelligence in combat and keeping its eye on enemy forces. As the unit is light and compact, it is employed primarily in surgical missions rather than high-risk, heavy-fire engagements. The Beaufort battle proved the vulnerability of such a unit in a high-attrition fight. Golani's logistical tail, or supply company, is considered one of the IDF's best. In Lebanon, it was the only unit to get hot food every day and in combat. Given adequate planning and dedicated men, medical and supply units were never too far from the forces, pushing their wares forward by truck, helicopter, and by parachute drops from C-130 aircraft. Ammunition, fuel, food, and water, as well as spares and reserve vehicles, and even mail, were always available to the forces. The State of Israel was born in war, and the threat of violence is never far from any citizen's mind. Israel prides itself on being an egalitarian society, And the very suggestion that some of its military forces are better than others goes against social custom. Desperation forced the creation of the Haganah and the Palmach before independence. The men and women of the kibbutzes who farmed and fought are far from the contemporary urban landscape of Israel. All Israelis who believe in fighting for their homeland are in many ways an elite force unto themselves. Their battle cry remains, never again.